Middle Way Philosophy Introductory Video 1C, The Middle Way and Science by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 1. The middle way is a principle of judgment for everyone in all kinds of different situations. It involves reliance on our experience rather than on absolute beliefs, whether positive or negative. That reliance on experience to justify what we believe is obviously something that the middle way has in common with science. That doesn't mean, of course, that it's identical to science. The emphasis in science tends to be on the specialized investigation of specific evidence which might contribute to an overall public set of knowledge that gradually grows with each new scientific discovery. However, middle way philosophy focuses not on the extension of public knowledge so much as on individual judgment. Even scientists are individuals. They have to make individual judgments in the course of their work, and in that way, middle way philosophy is very relevant to them. Middle way philosophy focuses not so much on evidence, though of course that's always important, as on what might lead us to make mistakes in how we interpret what we experience. Science can be, and often is, practiced in recognition of the degree of uncertainty that affects our recognition on our engagement with the world. However, it's also possible to make a dogma out of science or out of the discoveries of science. To put it briefly, some kinds of interpretations of science see science as telling us how things really are. If you try and practice science in relation to the middle way, though, you will take scientific information as our best information so far. Another way of putting that same distinction is that one way of seeing science sees science as discovering laws of nature. That's often also known as scientific naturalism. The alternative way of viewing science, though, is as a set of provisional theories. Science cannot be a recognition of laws of nature. The arguments of skepticism, as discussed in another video in this series, makes that clear. The supposed laws of nature that may have been discovered by science are based on an extremely small survey of evidence from the universe. If you consider the infinity of the universe and the incredibly small cranny of it that we've managed to survey in extremely limited ways, the idea that we could discover a law of nature begins to seem incredibly arrogant. That same distinction is also one between absolute and incremental kinds of justification of science. On the one hand, you can see science as having discovered things which are true, which are thus absolutely true. They're either true or they're not true. But much more adequate to the way that science actually works and the kind of evidence it can offer us is to see scientific discovery as incremental. That is, it is justified to a matter of degree. It may be extremely well justified, but nevertheless not absolutely justified. A theory being extremely well justified is the basis of confidence. Confidence is an embodied state. That is, we feel it in our whole bodies. If we are confident in things being a certain way, we're often used to practically relating to them in that way. But at the same time, our bodies are adaptable enough for us at least to be able to imagine things being different and to have the possibility of adapting if they turn out to be different. That's a very different kind of state to hanging everything on one kind of belief so that everything is lost if that belief turns out to be false. It's the difference between confidence and fragility. We generally have good grounds for having quite a high level of confidence in science. Not that science is infallible, of course not. But in fact, our confidence is justified by the fact that it doesn't claim to be infallible, that it's capable of re-examining its beliefs and their justification. A good example of that is medicine, where we quite literally entrust our bodies and their health to science and to scientific discovery. All that so far may sound like common sense to some scientists, but here's the bit that they often find a bit more difficult. That is the notion that the justification of science itself is a matter of human judgment and the quality of that human judgment. That science isn't true in the sense that the theories of science line up with some external reality. Such external reality is irrelevant to us because we have no access to it, as skeptical arguments make clear. That doesn't mean, however, that we're caught in some sort of relativist isolation, where we can have no justification for our beliefs. On the contrary, it's our judgments themselves, our human judgments, that provide that justification for science. So I want to argue that the justification of science depends on the following of the middle way in scientific judgment. The middle way for scientists will involve navigating between positive absolutes and negative absolutes, just like any other practice of the middle way by any other individuals. The positive absolutes for scientists would involve scientific absolutism. That is, the belief that through observation we know the final truth in some way, that science tells us what is ultimately the case, laws of nature and so on. The other extreme, however, is scientific relativism. That involves the assumption that any theory is as good as any other theory. We haven't really got any further since Aristotle, according to scientific relativists. But there's no justification for that, because scientists have been improving the adequacy with which they judge, as well as building on the further judgments of other scientists in the past, and encapsulating those judgments in the procedures of science itself. So the middle way for scientists builds on evidence, it also builds on past science and the procedures used by science, as we'll see in a minute. But it also necessarily involves provisional judgments. It's that provisionality which is central to the justification of any scientific claim. Provisionality is treated in more detail in the video with that title earlier in this series. However, here's a brief summary of that. Provisionality involves awareness of our limitations and the possibility of considering an alternative to my current beliefs. So awareness of our limitations requires critical awareness, and the consideration of alternatives is equivalent to optionality, that is, having other options other than what we believe now. That's connected to the imagination. But modern science often depends on teamwork far more than on individual provisional judgments, although individuals are of course always involved. Not only are teams of researchers often working in a particular specialisation, but there's still also a wider group of scientists involved in any piece of research, the group of those who scrutinise and review the work that's been done. In these circumstances then, it's not so much the individual's provisionality that's at stake in making that science objective. Rather, it's the kind of procedures that have become embedded into scientific culture and tradition. A good example of the ways in which a particular tradition, a practice in that tradition, may have resulted in greater objectivity is the use of double-blind testing in medical research. This is intended to avoid confirmation bias. Double-blind testing is centrally an aspect of the judgment and the way in which judgment is made. More credibility is given to that judgment when double-blind testing has been used than otherwise. But probably the most important point where individual provisionality is involved in scientific progress is that of paradigm shift. This is a term used by the philosophers of science Imre Lakatos and Thomas Kuhn when researching the issue of scientific progress and what scientific progress consists in. A paradigm is an overall way of thinking or a set of assumptions, which gives rise to a set of specific theories. It's only the specific theories that can be tested. It's when those tests result in negative results that something new is found out, because that specific theory can then be modified in the light of the test results. When that process has happened a good many times, and also when the testing itself of the specific theories turns out to be less fruitful as time goes by, paradigms begin to lose their power. That's when there's a big judgment call for scientists. Do you give up on the old paradigm because it's becoming less fruitful? Or do you stick to it on the grounds that nothing's certain and it might still turn out to be right? That's crucially where the middle way becomes perhaps most important for scientific judgment. Without that learning process and the possibility of questioning even the most basically entrenched paradigm, one can end up with dogmatic science or scientism. That's where there's a positive feedback loop in which absolute and unquestionable assumptions continue to be reinforced. They may be tested, but the results of the tests are only interpreted in terms of the assumptions you started with. The original paradigm is just constantly confirmed by whatever the new evidence is. Falsifications of that evidence are never sought out, so nothing is in effect learnt. Science becomes of much less value to the world when it becomes like this. It can't really be differentiated from pseudoscience. It lacks objectivity. That's why, more than anything, science needs the middle way. So, to summarise, scientific method is often, in practice, provisional, or at least it's worked to include provisional ways of working. It needs to avoid scientific absolutism on the one hand, where absolute truths have been discovered, or scientific relativism on the other, where any claim is as good as any other claim. Science can be a major source of inspiration and of information relevant to the middle way, and it's one of the major ways in which Western sources have helped to develop our understanding of the middle way. The spirit of the middle way is found basically in individual judgment, not just in scientific procedures, but scientific procedures can also help to justify and support the middle way. The objectivity of scientists is based on provisional and incremental judgments, avoiding absolutes. Scientific objectivity is based on the values of scientists, not just the facts, because it's based on the way in which scientists judge things. Those judgments depend on their values, not just on what they believe to be the case. Science is not justified merely by testing and questioned facts, which can result simply in the recycling of dogma rather than the gaining of more adequate understanding of the universe.